wind howled like a forlorn spirit outside the ancient estate of Ravenswood Manor. It was November's twilight, a time when the sun fled swiftly, leaving the land shrouded in murky grays. Miles away from the nearest town, the manor stood, a monument to bygone days, its dark turrets clawing at the sky. Elias Greyson approached the threshold, the invitation clenched tightly in his gloved hand. Though he'd been summoned for Thanksgiving dinner, the envelope's crimson wax seal bore an unsettling aura. "I haven't seen Uncle Dorian in years," Elias muttered under his breath, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath his boots the only reply. A faint unease prickled his senses, but the pull of family duty outweighed his apprehension. Besides, Uncle Dorian's letter had promised not just a reunion, but the resolution to an old and bitter dispute over the family estate. The heavy oak door creaked open before Elias could knock. "Master Greyson," intoned a gaunt butler with sunken eyes, his pallor reminiscent of cold marble. "You are expected." The servant's bony hand gestured toward the flickering light of a vast dining hall. Shadows danced along the intricately carved walls, their shapes shifting as though alive. Elias stepped inside, the air thick with the scent of roasting meats and something more elusive, earthy and metallic, a whisper of decay masked by spices. The dining table stretched nearly the length of the hall, laden with an opulence that defied reason. Golden brown turkeys, glistening candied yams, and pies gleaming under the light of a chandelier fashioned to resemble the claws of some forgotten beast. Yet the chairs sat empty. All save one. At the head of the table sat Uncle Dorian, aged and frail, but with eyes that burned like coals. "Elias, my boy," he crooned, his voice as dry and brittle as dead leaves. "You've come at last. The blood of the Greysons still runs deep, does it not?" Elias forced a polite smile. "It does, Uncle. I'm honored by your invitation." Yet his gaze flickered to the other empty chairs. "Will the others not be joining us?" Dorian chuckled, a sound that crawled like spiders over Elias's skin. "Oh, they will, my dear nephew. In due time. For now, let us give thanks for what is already here." He gestured to the feast with a claw-like hand, veins like knotted roots bulging beneath parchment-thin skin. Elias hesitated, his unease mounting. "It seems extravagant for just the two of us." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken questions, but Dorian's gaze, sharp and unyielding, rooted him to his seat as though unseen chains bound him there. Before Elias could press further, a low, distant sound echoed through the hall. Faint footsteps, or perhaps something else entirely. They seemed to come from the shadows beyond the chandelier's light, creeping closer with every beat of Elias's racing heart. The echoing footsteps halted as abruptly as they began, leaving the dining hall cloaked in a suffocating silence. Elias shifted uneasily in his seat, his eyes darting toward the darkened corners of the room. The shadows seemed to writhe and swell, growing darker, deeper, as if they had substance. Uncle Dorian raised a goblet of deep red liquid, the color of garnets, and offered a sly smile. "To family," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling weight. "And to the bonds we cannot sever." Elias hesitated before lifting his own glass. The scent of the drink, wine perhaps, sharp and metallic. He drank cautiously, the liquid chilling his tongue. "This estate, it feels as though time has forgotten it," Elias remarked, hoping to redirect the atmosphere. "How have you kept it so well preserved?" Dorian's smile grew tighter. "Ah, my dear boy, time may forget, but memory does not. This house is a vessel for remembrance, for keeping alive those who came before us." His fingers tapped the table in a rhythmic pattern, the sound echoing unnaturally loud in the vast room. The shadows near the doorway seemed to shift, and Elias flinched. "Is someone else here?" he asked, his voice tinged with nervous laughter. "I could have sworn—" Dorian's hand rose to silence him. "Patience," he murmured. "The rest of our guests are arriving. In the meantime, tell me, Elias, do you remember your childhood visits here? How you used to wander these halls?" Elias frowned, a vague unease coiling in his chest. "I do, though I admit my memories are hazy. I recall the garden, the old fountain, but there were always parts of the house I wasn't allowed to see. For good reason," Dorian said cryptically, sipping from his goblet. "Certain doors were not meant to be opened, certain truths not meant to be known." His words carried a veiled warning, but curiosity sparked within Elias. "I was a child then," Elias countered, leaning forward. "Surely now I'm old enough to understand." Before Dorian could respond, the chandelier flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the light returned, the air felt heavier, colder. Elias froze. The once empty chairs surrounding the table were no longer vacant. Silhouettes sat in each one, their forms obscured by the wavering light. Some appeared human, others grotesquely misshapen, their features indistinct but hauntingly familiar. Elias gasped, his throat tightening as he glanced toward Dorian, who appeared entirely unperturbed. "Meet the Greysons," Dorian said softly. "Every branch of our family tree is represented here tonight. They've come to witness what must be done." "What are you talking about?" Elias whispered, his voice trembling. His heart hammered as he watched one of the shadowed figures shift, its hollow eyes seeming to fix on him. Dorian's smile was devoid of warmth. "You've been chosen, Elias. Tonight, you will give thanks, not just for what you have, but for what you will become." Elias tried to stand, but his body felt leaden, as though the air itself had turned against him. The figures around the table began to murmur in low, guttural voices, their words unintelligible but oppressive. Panic surged within him as he realized there was no escape. Elias's breath came in short, panicked gasps as the figures around the table seemed to solidify, their grotesque forms becoming clearer in the dim light. The Greysons, if these things could be called such, were a mix of human and something else entirely. Their faces bore the faint echoes of family resemblance, twisted by decay, and something more sinister. One leaned closer to Elias, its eyes empty voids, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, as if it wanted to speak but couldn't. "What is this madness?" Elias managed, his voice cracking as he tried to wrench himself free from the invisible weight holding him in place. Dorian's eyes gleamed with an unnatural light. "Madness? No, Elias. This is tradition. For generations, the Greysons have survived through a pact sealed in blood and shadow. You, my dear nephew, have been called here to carry it forward." Elias's mind reeled. "A pact? What are you talking about? I never agreed to anything." Dorian sighed, as though Elias's protests were a mere inconvenience. "You agreed the moment you accepted my invitation. It is the way of our bloodline. Each generation must give thanks. not just to fortune or fate, but to the ones who ensure our survival. He gestured to the darkened corners of the room, where the shadows seemed to thrum with malevolent energy. "This is insanity," Elias spat, his voice rising in desperation. "I came here for dinner, for family, not for whatever this is." Dorian leaned forward, his frail hand gripping Elias's wrist with surprising strength. "Do you think our wealth, our influence, came without cost? The Greysons have always paid the price, Elias. Tonight, you must decide whether to honor that legacy or to be consumed by it." Elias struggled, his mind racing for an escape. The figures around the table began to chant, their voices low and guttural, resonating with the weight of something ancient. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, as though the very house was alive, feeding on the tension. "Stop this!" Elias shouted, his voice breaking through the eerie cacophony. "I'll have no part in this ritual." Dorian's expression darkened. "You misunderstand, nephew. This is not a choice." He gestured, and suddenly the table shifted. The grand feast vanished, replaced by a single object at its center, a ceremonial dagger, its blade gleaming with an unearthly sheen. Elias recoiled, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "What do you expect me to do with that?" "To give thanks," Dorian replied, his voice now a hollow echo. "One life sustains the rest. It has always been so. You must choose, Elias. Sacrifice yourself, or someone you hold dear." Elias's stomach turned as a shadowed figure emerged from the darkness, dragging something behind it. His heart stopped when he recognized the shape. A young girl, bound and gagged, her terrified eyes locking with his. "No!" Elias cried, surging to his feet, his limbs finally free from their paralysis. He turned to Dorian, rage and fear colliding in his chest. "This is monstrous. It is necessary," Dorian intoned, rising slowly, his frailty suddenly forgotten. "The shadows demand it, Elias. If you refuse, the pact will break, and the Greysons will face their end." The chanting grew louder, the shadows pressing closer, their whispers curling around Elias's mind like vines. He looked back at the girl, tears streaming down her face, and felt the weight of the dagger in his trembling hand. He was trapped, forced to choose between a nightmare and oblivion. Elias stood frozen, the cold weight of the dagger in his hand feeling impossibly heavy. The chanting around him swelled, filling the room with an unbearable pressure. His eyes darted from the terrified girl on the floor to Uncle Dorian, who now seemed more shadow than man, his features warped and flickering, like a candle struggling against the wind. "You can end this, Elias," Dorian said, his voice low and serpentine. "One life for the many. It has always been the way." Elias gripped the dagger tighter, his knuckles turning white. "You call this tradition, this abomination? How can you stand here and demand such a thing?" Dorian tilted his head, his expression devoid of pity. "Because I have stood where you stand now. Each Greyson before you has faced this moment, and each has made their choice. That is why we thrive, Elias. That is why we endure." The room seemed to close in on Elias, the shadows creeping closer, their murmurs growing louder, more insistent. The figures at the table watched him intently, their hollow eyes glimmering with faint, otherworldly light. He felt their expectations pressing against his mind, urging him toward a decision he couldn't bear to make. "Let her go," Elias said, his voice trembling. I won't sacrifice an innocent for this curse. Dorian's eyes narrowed. Do you think the shadows will simply let you walk away? You cannot defy them. If you refuse, they will take both of you, and the Greyson's legacy will crumble into dust. The girl whimpered, her muffled cries tearing at Elias's heart. He dropped to his knees before her, his hands shaking as he struggled to find clarity in the chaos. I'm so sorry, he whispered, tears streaming down his face. I don't know what to do. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the shadows surged forward, their presence oppressive and suffocating. The air grew thick with the scent of decay and blood, and the room itself seemed to quake. Elias could feel the weight of countless generations bearing down on him, their choices echoing in his mind like a cruel refrain. Suddenly, a thought pierced through the haze. Elias stood and faced Dorian, his voice cutting through the din. If it's my choice, then I choose you. Dorian's expression twisted with fury and fear. You dare! Before he could finish, Elias lunged forward, the dagger slicing through the air. Dorian staggered backward, his hands clutching his chest, as a dark, viscous shadow poured from the wound. The figures around the table let out a collective wail, their forms dissolving into smoke as the shadows writhed in agony. The room trembled violently, the chandelier crashing to the ground as the oppressive darkness began to dissipate. Elias dropped the dagger, his chest heaving as he turned to the girl. He freed her bonds with shaking hands, pulling her to her feet as the walls of Ravenswood Manor seemed to groan with the weight of collapsing centuries. You did it, she whispered, her voice weak but filled with gratitude. Elias shook his head, his heart heavy with the cost. Number, I only bought us time. The shadows will return, but this ends with me. No one else will carry this burden. They fled into the night, the cold wind biting at their faces as the manor crumbled behind them, swallowed by the very shadows it had harbored for so long. Elias knew he had broken the cycle, but at what cost? The echoes of the Greyson's dark pact would haunt him forever, but for now, he clung to the fragile hope of redemption. As the first light of dawn pierced the horizon, Elias whispered a prayer of thanks, not to the shadows, but to the courage he had found in the face of them. The nightmare was over, at least for now.